June 6, 1944, Longues-sur-Mer, Normandy, France. The first light had not yet burned away the Atlantic mist when a German coastal artillery officer climbed the narrow ladder to the fire control post and brought his binoculars to the slit. The horizon was wrong. Where he expected open water, there were shapes upon shapes, grey and low and endless, hulls stacked behind hulls until sea and steel blurred. He counted because he had been trained to count range and bearing with the rhythm of a metronome, but the numbers dissolved in the sheer volume. Beyond the anchored lines of warships lay rank after rank of smaller silhouettes, the stub-nosed craft that ran fast and shallow. A signalman at his elbow whispered a number they had all heard over the past weeks from Berlin broadcasts and frontline gossip and rumor. And now it felt inadequate. 7,000 ships. In that moment, the officer understood something his manuals never taught him. A truth about mass that no single battery could shift. The war in the West was no longer a contest of tactics. It had become a problem of scale, and scale had chosen its side. He had 4 150mm guns beneath him, set into concrete casemates that smelled of oil and damp chalk. Their arcs covered a section of coast between the British beaches codenamed Gold and the American sector toward Omaha. In training, those guns reached out beyond 20 kilometers, and on the range tables everything made sense. Today the sea answered with a geometry the manuals never pictured. A layered fortress afloat. Battleships and cruisers sat hull down. Screen destroyers fussed forward, and behind them, in a sprawl that seemed to touch England itself, lay the amphibious force. The officer keyed the field telephone and began to speak a cadence of bearings and target classes. But the voice that came back from the plotting room below carried a question he could not resolve. Which one? There were too many which ones. The thesis of this day is operational, not rhetorical. The Allied armada off Normandy outmatched the Atlantic Wall on 3 axes at once: mass, tempo, and resilience. Mass is the obvious one. By dawn of June 6, the Allies had concentrated close to 7,000 vessels of all types: warships, transports, landing craft, tugs, and service ships and assemblage, without precedent in naval history to that date. Tempo followed from mass. A force of that size could stagger waves in hours, and then minutes until the landings became continuous flow rather than discrete events. Resilience is what happens when that flow is sustained under fire, and whether until local defeats cannot halt the system. The German officer in the bunker did not need to recite the terms. He could see them in motion across the water. The night had already brought the first dislocation. Before the fleet appeared, parachutes had fallen inland more than 20,000 Allied airborne troops, dropping east of the Orne and west of the VR to seize crossings. So confusion and tangle the German response routes into knots. Reports up the chain mentioned bridges taken, causeways blocked, and units scattering to rally points under hedgerows they did not know. The German defense in Normandy had been designed as a layered problem for an attacker: beach obstacles and mines, fixed guns, infantry sectors with interlocking fields of fire, mobile reserves of panzers to strike where the main blow landed. It depended on time to identify the Schwerpunkt, time to release armored divisions tightly held by Berlin, time for air to be contested. By dawn, the airborne landings had taken some of that time away. By first sight of the Armada, Allied air power took more. Allied fighters and fighter bombers ruled the morning sky. In occupied France, the Luftwaffe could put up only a fraction of the sorties. The Allies launched over the Channel. That imbalance was not new on June 6th. It was the product of a campaign that had stretched back through 1943 into the winter of 1944. Hammering fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, and the aircraft industry itself. Operationally, the result in Normandy was simple. German columns that tried to move by day found their roads watched and their crossroads cratered. Requests for the release of armored reserves moved slowly through a command system centralized on a sleeping dictator and a headquarters culture that mistrusted initiative. The 7th Army sector commander needed panzer divisions that belonged on paper to a higher reserve. Those divisions could not move without authorization that did not come at first light. The delay is measurable in kilometers, not traveled before noon, and positions not reached before evening. and it mattered more than any single strongpoint on the beach. From the fire control slit, the armada resolved into classes. The great ships began to fire. Naval gunfire in this battle is easy to reduce to tonnage and calibers, but its effect here felt like a change in the texture of the world. The first salvos from British and American battleships and cruisers walked across the bluffs and batteries, smashing observation posts and tearing communications lines the garrison had buried with care. The batteries at Longues-sur-Mer answered. There is a record of shells from those for 150s landing among Allied ships and near a transport, and one gun kept up intermittent fire into the afternoon despite bombardment. The officer supervised ranging corrections against a cruiser that had edged forward, and for a minute the war felt like arithmetic again. But for every target he could mark, the sea offered him 20 more. Naval gunfire translated Allied mass into local effects. When bombs dropped through pre-dawn clouds, often overshot hardened positions, guns with spotters and ranging optics could adjust continuously until concrete failed. Destroyers crept so close beneath the bluffs that gunners in some sectors could see the men on their bridges, trading steel with casemates to protect the assault craft flitting past. What moved past beneath that umbrella of fire was the real instrument of decision. The landing craft came in waves, organized to the minute, beach by beach. On Omaha, where German defenses were strongest, and the 352nd Infantry Division had replaced weaker coastal troops, the first American waves met machine gun lanes that had survived bombing. Mortars zeroed on exits, and obstacles crammed with mines. Casualty rates in sectors of that beach rose high enough in the first hours that officers on the spot considered withdrawal. On Utah, currents pushed the first wave south of its intended zone, and a general on the sand famously decided that the error was fortune, and ordered units to proceed inland from where they were. On Gold and Juno, British and Canadian forces fought from beach shingle through towns whose names would be written on road signs throughout Normandy by evening. On Sword, British troops linked with airborne elements along the Orne and pushed for across all 5 beaches. The metric that mattered was throughput. How many men, vehicles, and tons of supplies per hour could be pushed across a narrow strip of sand, through exits choked by obstacles and fire. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had put roughly 156,000 troops ashore by sea and air. Normalized by time, that is on the order of 6,000 to 7,000 men per hour averaged across daylight, given the staggered schedules and beach conditions. An output sustained under direct fire in several sectors and rebuilt where the surf and chaos tore schedules apart. German doctrine demanded a counterstroke before the invader could consolidate. In Normandy, the formations meant to deliver that stroke were divided by allegiance and location. The 21st Panzer Division stood closest behind Caen. Elements did counterattack toward the coast in the afternoon and briefly reached the line between Sword and Juno, before being forced back by anti-tank guns and naval fire called in with frightening speed. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzer-Lehr lay farther south, their march routes under the eye of Allied reconnaissance. Requests to release the armored reserve had to travel up to the highest level. The decision loop consumed hours that air power and paratroopers and naval guns were designed to deny. This is not an indictment of individual German units, many of which fought with skill and consistency throughout the day. It is a description of a system that had centralized authority for fear of deception, and thus became exquisitely vulnerable to exactly that deception, and to physical interdiction when it most needed speed. The deception mattered. For months before June 6th, the Allies had run Operation Fortitude, a campaign of false traffic and dummy formations designed to convince German intelligence that the main blow would fall not in Normandy, but in the Pas-de-Calais. It worked well enough to achieve the crucial operational effect. The 15th Army remained poised near Calais, long after the beaches at Normandy were open and pushing inland. A reserve held for the wrong coast might as well have been held in another theatre when the decisive hours ticked by, when German staff officers in the West tried to reconcile coastal reports with their preconceptions. They found themselves trapped by their own hypothesis. Intelligence is not neutral math. It is a conversation with bias, and bias in June 1944 kept men and divisions idle, where movement might have mattered. From the German officer's vantage, all of that strategic architecture expressed itself in the problem of targets. In the morning, his battery exchanged rounds with ships. Through late morning and into early afternoon, the radio carried disconnected fragments. A battalion to the west reporting that British infantry had reached a village behind the bluffs. A sector to the east asking for artillery on a road junction already cut by demolitions in the night. Higher headquarters requesting updates that could not be precise because the lines on the coastal map no longer predicted anything on the ground. He had been told that the Atlantic Wall was a barrier. Today, it felt like a sieve under pressure, where the assault had stalled in places. Destroyers nosed in and poured 5-inch shells into gun embrasures until units could move. Where lanes had been cleared, bulldozers and engineers pushed exits through the beaches, while military police waved streams of vehicles in pre-planned order. Tanks and self-propelled guns, then transports, then more infantry, then the unglamorous backbone of it, all fuel Bowsers. Ammunition lorries, water trailers, signals trucks, field kitchens. Logistics is an unromantic word, but on the morning of June 6th it defined what could and could not be held by nightfall. The officer had studied the Allied landing attempts at Dieppe in 1942, an operation that, as framed in German training, had confirmed the strength of prepared defenses against frontal assault. Dieppe had been shorter, narrower, and unsupported by the kind of depth of force now on display. The Allied staff had learned, revised, and planned toward mass and redundancy. If a beach exit failed at 0900, it would be reopened by 1100. If a demolition was missed, engineers with another plan would arrive behind the first. If a unit lost its bearings in a field where hedgerows turned straight lines into a maze, the next wave carried more maps and radios, and a new set of orders keyed to landmarks and not hopes, where the Germans had designed interlocking strongpoints to make the beach a killing ground. Allied staff had drawn schedules that treated the beach as a temporarily dangerous logistics node that must be cleared and maintained at rates defined in tons per hour. The two mental models intersected on that sand. One needed to break the attacker within a window measured in hours. The other needed to survive those hours and keep the queue moving. By midday the mist had lifted. The officer saw details instead of masses, white wakes crossing wakes, LCTs lowering ramps, tanks wading and sometimes drowning when holes swallowed men and machines whole, engineers flagging safe lanes with colored tapes, stretcher parties bent low. He saw a destroyer throwing its bow toward the beach in a gesture of precision bordering on defiance, taking on fire from a pillbox and answering at a range a gunnery teacher would have called reckless in peacetime. He saw signal lamps chatter between ships and beach, a language of angles and pulses no bombardment could mute. He knew enough about production to understand that ships lost here would be replaced, and the men on them replaced, and that for the attacker this day had a reserve behind it rated in months of deliveries, before it ceased to be a trickle. For his side, the reserve was narrower. German units in France had been cannibalized to feed the Eastern Front for years. Fuel stocks were thin. The best formations in the West existed more on paper than in spare parts inventories. Airfields were targets. Radios failed after near misses shook dust into their relays. He could not quantify all of that from his bunker, but he could feel it in how long it took for messages to return, in how many times he called an artillery unit that did not answer, in the silence after a battery to the east reported it was shifting position and then stopped reporting at all. When he looked again through the slit, he chose a smaller targeter line of craft clustered off a sector where the beachhead had thickened into a patch of brown and olive. He passed a bearing. The guns below replied. A few minutes later, another bearing. One gun fell silent while damaged crews fought a fire inside the casemate. The casualty was not a ship. It was heat and shock and exhaustion after hours of fire. The battery officer could have been any professional watching a system under stress. He measured rate of fire, barrel temperature, crew fatigue, the drop in accuracy that comes when ears ring and eyes water, and men begin to anticipate the next concussion. He requested ammunition. The replies said the road behind them was under air attack and delivery would be delayed. He asked about a field telephone line. Runners had not found the break yet, and the alternate line was dead. Later in the afternoon, with 2 guns still available, he learned that infantry to his west had pulled back from a position that had anchored their flank, and what had been a sector diagram on a map became a space with uncertain edges. If the bunker were taken, he had a pistol and a few grenades, and the courage common to men who had tied themselves to a job. But courage could not move a division from Calais, or put kerosene in a tank, or wake a sleeping authorization hundreds of kilometers away. The numbers at day's end do not tell a single story. They tell several. Allied casualties on June 6th were heavy in places and light in others, varying by beach, hour, and luck. But the normalized figures that matter for the campaign show a system doing what it was built to do. On the first day, the Allies landed more than 150,000 men by sea and air, plus thousands of vehicles, and established lodgements that by nightfall, linked in places and in others, sat as separate heads, connected by lanes through which engineers and military police pumped throughput like blood. By comparison, German reinforcements into the immediate battle space were constrained by air attack and command delay to rates that never matched the Allied input. The imbalance did not vanish on June 7th or June 8th. It compounded. 2 artificial harbors, the Mulberries, would be assembled in the following days to regularize the flow. Further one off the British sector at Arromanches would survive the June storm and support the lodgment for months. The American Mulberry off Omaha would be wrecked by that storm, and the U.S. beaches would improvise with direct beaching and small harbors to sustain their flow anyway. The point is not that everything worked to plan. The point is that enough worked that failure in one subsystem did not stop the whole. Inside Germany, the implication of this day was acknowledged in different registers. Some officers in the field saw the Armada and understood that the war's West Front had pivoted from anticipation to reckoning. Staff officers at Army group level fought to do their jobs inside constraints that a skeptical reader can trace back to organizational choice. A dictator's insistence on control. A propaganda apparatus that could not adjust hypotheses quickly. An air defense net that had been outproduced and outtrained. In the east, the Red Army was preparing a summer offensive that would tear through Army Group Center within weeks. In Italy, the Wehrmacht had already yielded Rome. Those theaters mattered to the day's meaning, because strategic reserves cannot be in 3 places at once. If the German officer at Longues-sur-Mer had been handed a map of Europe at noon and asked to draw arrows showing where help might come from, he would have found his pencil hesitating over the same empty spaces Allied planners had designed into their war. By late afternoon, one of his guns was silent for the last time. Smoke hung in the bunker. The sea continued to bring things that looked like towns afloat. The officer wrote a short report by lantern light that summarized position, ammunition, and damage, and there was a sentence in it about the density of enemy shipping that broke from his usual style. It did not say that the war was lost. The sentence said that the enemy's naval concentration was on a scale for which no previous French coast engagement provided a comparison. In the professional language of a man who had spent his life measuring ranges and deflections, that was what the phrase "it is over" looked like. He was not alone in that private assessment. Contemporary German accounts from Normandy include expressions of shock at the breadth of the Allied assault and the inability to deploy reserves at decisive speed. Those views are not betrayals. They are the last, honest duty of a soldier trained to read a situation. A historian reading the day from the distance of decades can be tempted by narrative inevitability. Nothing about June 6th was automatic in the small. Men drowned in the surf. Engineers misjudged tides. Bombs fell wide. Tanks bogged and burned. In the small, it was chaos, and courage, and fear, and skill, and error. But in the large, the Allied plan embedded redundancy and the resources to eat the cost of the small. That is the operational meaning of the Armada the officer saw at dawn. 7,000 ships is not a boast. It is a statement about industrial mobilization that converted coal and iron and labor and logistics into a single day's capacity. To move and fight and supply across a hostile shore, and to keep doing so tomorrow and the next day until numbers become positions and positions become outcomes. At night, tracer and star shells sketched the line between sea and land. Fires marked towns whose names would become dates inscribed on regimental colors. The officer's bunker shook one last time as a near-miss caved earth against concrete. And for a few minutes there was only dust, and the taste of grit, and the ringing that follows a concussion too close to the skull. When the air settled, he could hear not the sea, but the hum of engines ashore. Hundreds of them, tracks squealing on curves. Gearboxes grinding as drivers learned the country. That sound, normalized over hours, is how the day ended. It was not a victory parade. It was throughput. The legacy of the day that began in mist is measured in the weeks that followed. The beachheads linked and thickened. Ken became a drawn-out fight that held German armor, while the Americans pushed west and then turned the corner at Ivrenches. The Pas-de-Calais reserves remained slow to shift, their caution anchored by Allied deception that continued to whisper of a second landing that never came. When Paris was liberated in August, it was not because a single bunker had fallen in June, but because ports and depots and road nets had been brought into a system that fed divisions moving east faster than a battered enemy could stop them. The German officer at Longues-sur-Mer would have had little comfort in that analysis, but he would have recognized its logic. On June 6th he had watched a continental decision expressed as ships on a horizon. He had seen a line between problems that could be solved by courage and drill, and those that could not be solved by anything but capacity. There is a sober way to end this story that respects those who fought and those who died around that bunker, and on those beaches and in the fields beyond. It is to say that individuals mattered and still were bounded by systems. The Atlantic Wall mattered and still failed where it confronted an adversary that had spent 2 years aligning production, training, deception, and doctrine into a sequence that turned the channel from barrier into corridor. The officer at the fire control slit mattered because he did his job to the last message, and still the view before him told him the truth. The truth was that a democracy and an empire and a commonwealth and a resistance and an arsenal had learned how to act in concert. And when they arrived not as a raiding party, but as an economy in motion. When he lowered his binoculars for the last time that day, he knew because any trained observer would have known that you cannot stop an economy in motion with 4 guns in concrete. You can only mark the bearing and do the arithmetic and write it down, and then you can live long enough to watch the arithmetic work. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.